Welcome, Nikole, and thank you for your willingness to share your expertise and absolutely your wisdom with us during our 7th annual Urban Superintendents Academy Leadership Summit. Our theme for the summit is bold leadership, leadership, equity, accountability, and disruption. I mention that because we feel that these are really key components and a cornerstone for the discussion, and we wanted to tee it up in that way. And so as we prepare to dive right in, we know that, want you to know that and kind of reiterate that AASA and Howard University and AASA and USC Urban Superintendents Academies are really focused on working to ensure that cohort participants are fully equipped to face the challenges and also the opportunities of the urban superintendency. And also in urban-like environments in areas with urban traits and variables. So we appreciate and honor the great success that you have had as a writer, as a researcher, a journalist, of course, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and here most, we'll get back to that in a minute, but I wanted to also pinpoint the inaugural Knight Chair in Race and Journalism. I believe that this is the 26th one since 1990, and that's great if I'm on point with that. And that whole notion is about bridging the newsroom and the classroom divide or gap with major projects. And that brings us to the whole notion of, first off, let's begin with the 1619 project and the connection with this academy and public education. We know that, that sparked great conversation and debate around the truth about American history. You mentioned what I'm going to paraphrase, and you correct me if I'm off point, but a separate parallel history, such as a separate Black history, white American history being taught, indigenous history, versus really an intertwined American history where you deal with the real multi-racial history and that approach. Can you talk a bit about that in the context of public schools and thinking about our audience of leaders that are leading these major complex organizations and what that might mean with your experiences going forward?
I don't have to tell any of the superintendents who are watching this today that we live in a multiracial nation. Our schools are now only slightly less than, our public schools, slightly less than half white, and the other half being made up of Asian, Black, Indigenous, and Latino students, and that we have been a multiracial country since 1619, when the first Africans were sold into Virginia, into a colony being established by the English, who would later become white, on land that was already occupied by the indigenous. So to tell those stories as separate is to fundamentally mistell the story of the United States of America, because from the very beginnings of the first colony that would go on to become the United States, we have been a multiracial country. And that's not how we've tended to tell that story. And what that has meant is we could not fully understand the country that we live in. We can't understand the past, and we also can't understand many of the tensions, many of the inequalities, many of the things that make this country great, without understanding that these histories have been always intertwined, and that these three groups at the very beginning have shaped the country that would ultimately come to be. Now, I do believe in Black studies. I believe in ethnic studies. I believe in Latino studies. I believe in Indigenous studies. But that's the same way that you may have a American history class that focuses on the Civil War. It's because you understand by separating these histories, it allows you to provide more depth, because a comprehensive history, of course, can't include, well, no history can include anything, everything, but a comprehensive history can't dig down deep into the individual histories of each of these groups, which we should. But I think we have to tell a much fuller story. And this, I'll wrap the answer up, but the 1619 Project is a single origin story. It's not the origin story. There have to be, in a great country like ours, many origin stories, and there could certainly be a similar 1619-like project for Indigenous people that really tells and frames the story of America through Indigenous peoples. But this project really wanted to center Black Americans and the institution of slavery and bring what is really a fundamental part of our story from the margins to the center. So we have to be able to do both of those things at once to tell a much more comprehensive, representative, holistic history, and then also have these distinct histories that give the proper due to all of the different groups who have contributed to this country.
Much of what you just mentioned really does center on telling the full story of American history. And as you mentioned, from a multiracial standpoint, and as I listen to your comments that are so powerful, you know, when we think about public education and the leadership lens, we often here recently have spoken of leading with an equity lens, for example, equity versus equality. And when we mentioned the whole notion of our nation and the founding of our nation, and much of what we're discussing now, which has implications for curriculum and what we do teach in our schools and what we do embrace in our schools as the true facts and the full facts. And for the leaders in our audience, as CEOs in major urban districts, you know, they have the awesome responsibility of championing a strategic plan or a blueprint, as we call it. And when you lead from that equity lens, you talk about bringing all the stakeholders together to rally around this conversation. But that's heavy lifting, and sometimes it has to be done in increments, but not shying away from that. In your experiences with not just the 1619 Project, but the pushback that came from it and all of the challenges that we're facing now, what would you say to our leaders in the audience around their awesome responsibility for being able to move this forward, especially in our urban environments? And you know the demographics, you know what the challenges are with that. But there are ways to lead from an equity lens and work to incorporate these. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so let me first just kind of help us frame what is the history that we're taught in schools supposed to do? Because so much of the conversation around the 1619 Project, particularly those who oppose it, is they couch it as it being about the factual interpretation of history. But what it's really about is the narrative around history. And much of the history that we are taught in K-12, not just public schools, public and private, it is not a factual venture, it's a nationalistic venture. It is teaching us a certain history in order to create a shared perception of who and what we are as a country. And so we tend to really hold up the narratives of American exceptionalism, and we really downplay the narratives that counter that, like slavery, like colonialism, like Indian removal. But what that means is that we're not actually giving our students a proper understanding of American history, because history should not be about creating narrative or mythology or this idea that America is exceptional, but it should be about trying to accurately render an understanding of what happened. And some of that is going to glorify the country, and some of that is not, because countries are not divine. They actually are created by human beings who can do very magnificent things and very atrocious things at the same time. So I think a lot about, and I write about this in the opening essay for the 1619 Project book that's coming out this fall. I write about growing up as a Black student who was pretty much erased from the historical narratives we were taught in school. We didn't read any Black writers when we were learning American literature. American literature didn't include Black writers. It certainly didn't include Indigenous or Latino or Asian writers. We didn't learn about Black scientists. And as a child, no matter your race, you kind of presume that what you're being taught are the most important things. And so if no one is teaching it to you, then Black people must not have done anything important enough for us to teach. We must not have contributed much to our history. We must not have written really any great American literature that we needed to be taught. And so we learn as much from the absences in the curriculum as we do from what's actually in the curriculum, because we fill in those absences with our own understanding that if these things were things for us to know, our teachers, our textbooks, our literature would reflect them. So as we're thinking about a full accounting, we often, I think, treat these conversations about equity, about equality, as if they are kind of about political correctness or about a kind of faux representation that's about feeling good. But I argue that it's about accuracy. It's about an honest reflection of who we are as a country, and giving students who are not part of the racial majority something to aspire to, some part of the story that you can cling to. I recount this story of going into our school library and just searching for any book with a Black girl on the cover, any book at all, to make me feel like there was some representation of my story. And many white Americans never have to have that feeling. They can look around and they see themselves in all of the stories in the history books. They see themselves in all the literature that they're learning in class. And so when you have this sense that so many Americans, that not just Black Americans, that Black people don't have a history that needs to be taught. Black people didn't invent anything. Black people didn't write anything. That's coming from curricula. That's coming from how we are learning in schools. So when you understand that context, then to see the type of pushback against the 1619 Project makes sense. These are political pushbacks, right? The fight over curriculum is always political. It's always about power. It's always about who gets to shape how we think about ourselves as a nation and how we think about each other. And these times, I think, call for educators to exercise a great deal of courage. And we are seeing laws being considered and passed all across the country that are trying to really limit and control how much of this history we can teach our children, that really want to maintain these narratives of white supremacy, frankly. And that's not a term you ever see me really using in my writing, because I think it's a term people automatically dismiss. But when you look at these laws, that's actually what these laws are trying to do. And we're seeing educators really, in some ways, succumbing to that pressure. I'm hearing from teachers and superintendents who say, I'm afraid to teach, not the 1619 Project, but other texts, other books, other concepts, because they worry about what their state legislators are going to do. So I think we are, all of us, but particularly educators, are being tasked in this moment with having courage, with not allowing politicians to determine what we can teach to our students if what's being taught is actually an accurate history. And what's so funny about this is, the whole reason the 1619 Project exists in the first place is we haven't been taught an accurate history. So these people who say they're passing laws because they want to make sure our kids are only learning the facts only have to look at the textbooks and know that our kids have not been being taught the facts in the first place. They've been being taught a very politicized history. All history, there's history that is what happened, who did it, and where and why. And then there's history, which is what we think happened and why. And what we think happened and why is very politicized, and it is shaped by those in power. And we are, through the 1619 Project and other people, trying to unsettle that power and trying to say that other people can have some say over what is the narrative.
That's a very deep approach and response to that. And I say that because, within the program, we talk about the structure of public education. We talk about the notion that superintendents, and I mentioned leading as CEOs, but they also have elected boards for the most part.
Mhm.
So you mentioned being courageous leaders. You mentioned being I'm going to use the term intentional about this work. And that's absolutely on point. Think about your experience and all of the variables that we've just raised and the whole structure for the superintendent as a leader who has a board of 5 or 7 elected into office that might or might not have had conversations around any of this. And it's a responsibility of that CEO as the facilitator to begin that so that you build awareness and readiness of that board, which represents the policymakers, to be able to sustain and moving forward all of this courageous leadership. And so, and that's why we mentioned earlier the strategic plan and bringing stakeholders together. As you think about that structure and the whole notion of being a courageous leader and leading in this time so that you can sustain that, what would you say to the leaders about that structure and how to lead these elected officers that are on the board to get to policy so that it can really, really be an equity lens that works?
So I think it should be clear, I'm not a executive, I'm not a professional coach, I'm a journalist. And I can't tell very, very well educated people how to do their jobs. And frankly, I hate that we have introduced even the language of the market and business into the position of the superintendency, that we are calling them CEOs, because public schools are not a business. There's no product. And I think when we have started to utilize the language of the market, then we understand the language of the market, and the goal of the market is profit. The goal of the market is turning out workers. I believe that public schools are about a common good, and the goal of public schools should be about turning out citizens, and citizens who believe that they have some stake in their community and in each other. So if I could give one advice, it would be stop thinking about yourselves as CEOs and schools as a product with stakeholders. Every person in a community has a stakeholder in a public school. We all fund them. They are serving a common good, whether you have a child in those schools or not. And what I hope that they're focusing on is not producing workers, but in producing people who are good citizens, who see themselves as part of an ecosystem, and not just about individual success and individuals getting what they want. If we can change that thinking about how we are thinking about public schools, then I think the mind frame around what you do in this moment becomes very clear. Teaching a more accurate history, caring about diversity in a multiracial society, caring about a common good, and teaching students about democracy. These are values that you have to fight for, even if you have a board who is disinterested in those things. And this then, I think, leads you naturally to courage, because if all you're worried about are elected stakeholders, then you make decisions that are not in the best interest of children and community. But if you say, I know that this is the right thing to do for our kids in our community, then I think you make decisions that are in the best interest of children and community. Now, I'm not naive. I've spent, most of my career writing about public education and understanding that when you have a superintendent with an equity lens, a superintendent that's pressing for integration, that's pressing to equalize resources to lower performing and higher poverty schools, that you also face a board where if you have the support of that board, those people might be run out of office and you might be run out of office. Right. We've seen that many, many times. The reason why school boards don't support superintendents who have an equity lens is because they won't be in their job after the next election. So what do you do with that then? I think you have to decide what is most important. Is it important to be in your role, but not actually work on the things that you got into education to do? Or is it important to fight that fight and get as much work as you can done, justice work that you think is helping move a system towards equality. And if at the end of your term you have to move on, then you have to move on. So this is what I'm talking about when I say that we have to have courage. And I don't say this as someone who hasn't put skin in the game myself. You know, people may think I'm very successful now, but it took me a lot longer to get where I am than it would have taken other people who didn't hold to their values and morals as much as I did. I refused to align myself in institutions that didn't want me to do the type of work that I thought was important. I refused to compromise the type of work that I wanted to do. And it took me a lot longer to get here. And I nearly didn't get here at all. So I understand that the stakes are high. But I think when we're talking about public schools in particular, which of course in this country, we believe, as Horace Mann said, that schools are the great equalizer. But in fact, too often, as we know, public schools simply maintain the status that you had when you entered those schools. And what we don't talk about is that Horace Mann was willing to compromise the education of Black children in order to establish public schools. Not that he didn't believe Black children should go to public schools, but he just didn't think enough white people would support publicly funded schools if Black children were getting an education too. And so he made that sacrifice to establish public schools and then hoped that he would be able to add Black children in later. So this is the foundations of our system, a system that at once says schools are the great equalizer of our society, and yet some of us are not even in the society. So we're not going to bother with them at all. We're still struggling against those same battles, and folks who are willing to compromise equality for our children, I don't think should be public educators. And I think we have to have the type of courage to stand up to school boards. We have to have the type of courage to guide school boards into the direction that is necessary. And if you're having to compromise everything to stay there, what is your purpose?
I think that's a huge takeaway for the audience. Well, I don't think that, I know that it is, because the takeaway from that is that when you think about courageous leadership in this lens, that should be non-negotiable, and that it's more than a career, it's a calling. And, you know, and we've often heard that debated, but in this work, with the description and all of the complexities that we're describing, it has to be a calling in order to do it and do it the right way. Because as you talked about, not products, but we're dealing with people and producing outcomes and making changes. I think that's huge for the audience in terms of how they prepare or continue to sharpen their saw and skill set for doing the work. The other piece that you mentioned around education being a great equalizer, we hear that continuously as well. But at the same time, we hear public education being one of the greatest civil rights initiatives or needs. When you compare those two, it gets to the paradox, in my view, that you just mentioned. And then it goes back to the leadership piece. So when we come almost full circle to where we are now and over the past couple of years, and we touched on the 1619 project and all of the things that came into play and we talked about pushback. Let's think about the things that have transpired over the past couple of years. And then you mentioned slavery and the legacy of slavery. Whether it's George Floyd and the issues that were there, whether it's the insurrection on January the 6th, you know, that stems from the legacy of slavery and our inability to own it and deal with it, and maybe in an attempt to mitigate the negative impact. So we haven't talked about it. We haven't talked about race. And so here we are facing some of the things that we faced over the past couple of years. And you've written about that, and you've spoken a bit about that. Can you touch on that as well?
Yeah, I don't think it's that we haven't talked about it. I think we haven't talked about it in a sufficiently complex way. I think that we tend to really downplay the role of slavery. You know, the reason the 1619 Project exists is because we haven't wanted to grapple with the legacy of slavery. The English landed in Jamestown in 1607. We began African slavery just 12 years later, which means almost no institution in America is older than African slavery. But we're not taught that. And being one of the oldest institutions, it is impossible, if we are being logical, to believe that it's not a foundational institution, that it's not an institution that shaped so much of our governance, of our politics, of our culture, of our structures. Of course it did, but we're not taught it that way. So we're kind of taught slavery as an asterisk. We have to explain the Civil War. So we bring up a little bit about slavery, and then Black people disappear from the American story for 100 years. And Martin Luther King gives a speech in 1963. We don't explain why 100 years after slavery, he's having to give a speech asking for basic rights of citizenship. And then the story is done and Black people exit the story. That history does not explain the country in which we live. So by learning that history, we are actually ill-equipped to understand, how does George Floyd happen? What makes people in what was clearly a fair election decide to lead an insurrection on the Capitol to overturn an election in a country that we argue is the oldest democracy in the world, but that has not actually been a true democracy until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. So I think that we talk about race a lot. America is a race-obsessed country. If you travel to other countries, you don't put your race on every single form in every country. Like we are obsessed, but we're obsessed in a superficial way. We're obsessed in a way where we don't actually explain our society through the prism of race as a construct. So what I was trying to do with the 1619 Project is force a deeper understanding. And then, as you all know, the one thing that Black people hear constantly is slavery was a long time ago, why don't you get over it? So I wanted to show through the project that we can't get over the legacy of slavery because we haven't been honest and confronted it. And more importantly, we have not restored what was lost to Black Americans because of slavery. And that so much of the society we're in is still being shaped by slavery. We just pretend that it isn't. So we have to, one, begin with honesty. Our conversations about race and racism are not honest. We are much more interested in finding, the racist of the week, someone who said something racist, than actually examining the structures that hurt people's lives, mass incarceration, the fact that Black children are as segregated today as they were in the 1970s, the fact that Black Americans are the most segregated in housing of all racial groups, and that middle-class Black Americans live in poorer neighborhoods than poor white Americans. These are the structures that actually hurt people's lives, but we'd rather focus on, did this actor say something racist? So we haven't had the necessary conversations. And much more importantly, we haven't had action. So we can talk about racism all day. Talking doesn't change anything. We have to then use that narrative and that understanding of history and the ongoing legacy of slavery to move us to action, to actually undo the structures of inequality, which there's never been a majority of white Americans in this country who wanted to actually equalize our country in terms of race. And that's where we get stuck. We could talk all day. I've been talking about it just my own self for more than 20 years, right? And Black people have been talking about it since 1619, really. But how do we have a broader understanding? And then how do we then move that to action? Because what Dr. King said in 1967, so by 1967, we have had the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ends discrimination in public accommodations. We've had the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which finally ensures Black people equal access to the franchise. So we have Brown v. Board of Education. We've passed this major legislation that gives Black people finally the same rights as every other American. And yet two things are happening at that time. Black Americans in the North are rebelling, right? There are literally dozens of rebellions in the North, outside of the South, right? We think the South was the problem, but in Chicago, in Newark, in Detroit, in Watts, in small towns like Waterloo, in Milwaukee, you're seeing Black communities rebel. And what King says is that ending legal discrimination, that was the easy fight. But the real fight, the battle where he was going to lose all of his white support, all of his support from white moderates, was the fight for economic justice, for Black people to achieve restitution and economic parity. That's what he says in 1967. Now that's not the part of the King speeches that anybody ever wants to quote, but that's what he says, right? He says, what good is it to have the right to go in any restaurant you want if you can't afford a hamburger? You still can't go in the restaurant, even though you have the legal right to do so. And that's really the work that is left undone, is restoration for Black Americans for all of the wealth and all of the opportunities that were stolen. And until we have real action around those issues, the fact is, Black people, the wealth gap between Black and white Americans and the income gap between Black and white Americans is unchanged since the time that Dr. King got assassinated. Unchanged. It hasn't moved at all. It's still twice that of white Americans.
Right. And all of that comes when you think about income, and the research centers on that the better educated, the more effective you are, and it helps to increase income levels. Coming full circle back to public education again, the more effective we are with being able to move the needle and bridge that gap, I think that those things can begin to incrementally change. But it cannot just be Black people, can't just be people of color saying that. As we look at what has happened the past couple of years in the protests and all of that, there were some glimmer of examples of a multiracial approach with that too. And much has been written about diversity and stepping out, speaking about the atrocities against Black people, people of color, et cetera. But it's only been in increments. So that's another notion. That's probably a conversation for another day. But it also gets us to a similar piece where in the Times, it stated that the Times planned to take the 1619 project to schools. And with the curriculum that was developed in collaboration with the Pulitzer Center. Any update on that and the effect and where we are with that and what the audience should know?
Yes. So quickly before I get to that, because I am talking to educators and superintendents, schools are not the great equalizer. As you all know, schools cannot do everything on their own. Schools are being tasked with trying to resolve all of the other issues of inequality in housing, in healthcare, in employment, mental health. So we know that schools cannot do all of that. And actually the statistics on Black Americans who get an education are actually kind of depressing. They still have less wealth than white Americans with a high school diploma or less. But we know that relative in our community, those who don't have an education fare the worst. We do know that. So they won't, education doesn't have the same effects in terms of closing racial gaps for Black Americans, but it certainly changes the trajectory of Black Americans' lives. That's a fact. What I would like to just say though is if I ask anybody watching this, if they are surprised that Black schools with a majority of Black kids have the least funding, they would say no. If I say, are you surprised that schools that are Black majority have the least credentialed teachers? No one would be surprised at that. If I say, would you be surprised that the schools with a Black majority are the less likely to have the more rigorous academic classes like advanced placement, like physics, like higher level algebra? No one will be surprised that the answer is no. Same thing for technology, same thing for facilities. So we have all just accepted that Black kids get less. It's not shocking. We know it to be true. I argue that that's immoral and that our kids also know these facts. So we tell our students, we tell Black children in particular, that you have to value your education. The education is the most important thing for you. And we often condemn our children because we say they don't value education or their families don't value education. And yet then we build schools for them that affirm every day that we don't actually value their education, that we don't think they are important enough to get the same textbooks, the same facilities, the same level of teaching, the same honors level courses. So our children either rise up or rise down to the expectations that we have. And we show our expectations by the schools we build for them. So I would just call, and I know for the people on this call that education is a calling. It's not a field you get into because you think you're going to get a lot of glory or you think you're going to get a lot of money. But I think too many of us have accepted the fact that our children get less. And when we have accepted the fact that our children have gotten less, then we are affirming to our children what our society already tells them, which is that they are less valuable. So we had to stop succumbing to that narrative. Now, that's not your question, but I just had to get that out there.
Great.
So in terms of the 1619 project, we partnered, as you said, with the Pulitzer Center to turn the 1619 project into curricula. And last I checked, it was being taught in every state in America, though with these new laws, I'm not sure, how that looks right now. But educators were really clamoring for this curricula because what the polling shows is most of them don't feel like they've been adequately trained to teach the history of slavery and racism. Most don't feel like their teaching implements, their textbooks and their teaching guides are adequate. And so there was a great thirst for something that was giving a more honest interpretation, but also what educators loved about it was it made history relevant because every essay in the project begins with modern America. It is about the country we live in right now, and then using history to explain it. So, all of these educators that really struggled to have students understand why the past was relevant found the 1619 project's framing very useful. But it's also because so many educators were adopting the 1619 project that we've seen the type of pushback that we have. Before we started seeing statistics coming out about all of the schools and educators that were using the 1619 project, you didn't see this massive kind of organized pushback against the project. That happened once the project went into schools. And again, why is that? Because power is about narrative. It is about who gets to determine how we conceive of ourselves as a country. And the fear is that a generation of children could grow up with a different narrative about this country, one that is more honest and one that places Black Americans at the center. And that's a very scary thing for some people. But the project is still available for free, the curriculum at the Pulitzer Center. We have a cohort of public school, I think they're mostly public school educators who have gotten early copies of the 1619 book, and they're piloting new lesson plans, more in-depth lesson plans based on the book that they'll roll out sometime this fall. One thing that it's been very fulfilling for me to see and only affirms my deep respect for educators is educators don't like to be told that they're not professional enough to determine how to teach and what to teach. And many have just refused to be cowed by these laws, even as it could cost them. And I've been so inspired by the way the educators have and continue to use the project.
Great. That leads us, I think, to a very important closing thought.
Yes.
And again, we really thank you for your time that you've given us today. So I want to kind of connect the dots with just such rich information that you've given us and the implications for leadership, as you mentioned, in public education and being a courageous leader. And it gets to the voice of the leader. And with your unique experience and the innovative experience that you've had, what do you see in terms of the leader's voice and also staying true to their beliefs along being courageous as leaders? And when you think about closing thoughts for the audience from the leadership lens and your experiences from research and literature, et cetera, what are some closing thoughts that you could be important for this group?
So again, I always hate trying to kind of give advice to people who are much more educated in their own career than I am, right? I'm a journalist, and I know so much of what I could say. You all already know, and you already do in practice. But let me just affirm you and say that all my years spent as a student myself, as a parent, but more importantly, as a researcher, as a journalist who observed classrooms, observed schools, most of those schools serving, segregated, high poverty schools, that the leader means everything in the school, everything. That an effective, charismatic leader who believes in their children and who believes in their staff and their community can transform any school more than any resources you can put into that school. I have witnessed what a transformational leader who believes in the children more than anything can do. And I have witnessed when you have the opposite type of leader in a school, what that can do. And all of us have seen the same child who will cut up, talk back, not do the work in one class, goes into a classroom with another teacher who respects that child, who cares and will ask the child, why are you acting like this today? Are you hungry? Did something happen? That child will sit in that desk and do the work. So we know that leadership matters. I know it's not easy. Everything that you all have to deal with, COVID, budget cuts, what's happening with pressure from your boards and from your communities. But I as much as I critique public education, I do believe it is the greatest hope in our democracy. I think that there's no other place left where people across race and social class and community can come together in a common space and learn from each other. And it is valued work, even if we don't pay you like it is, and even if we sometimes don't respect you like it is. So continue to be the courageous and great leaders that you are. And I just hope that you will continue not to accept less for our children, even if they have less, that we understand that our children will rise to any expectations that we put on them.
Thank you for that. We hope that you will agree to come back and participate with our cohort and have an opportunity maybe at some point throughout this cohort year to actually meet them and engage with them, even if it's virtual. But at least you'll be able to know who's in the audience and who stepped forward to commit to taking on this challenge in the way that you've just described and that we've just described. And we always call it defying the norm. So sometimes we're tired of hearing it. I know I am. So it's like, when are we going to do it? So all of us come together with that energy to make that happen. But again, thank you for all of your work, and we look forward to connecting with you moving forward.
Thank you.
All right.